In Charles's previous life, Haley Summers had destroyed Kevin Neal's last chance of survival. Charles had thought that the two of them no longer needed to interact in this life. There should be no ties between them. According to the military, Neal was merely a teacher of martial arts. His attempts at teaching cultivation had yielded mixed results. The possibility of death for those learning the practice was very high. The military planned to reduce this risk to an acceptable level after a period of experimentation. Then they would use their stature to spread the knowledge to the people. When the public could safely enjoy the benefits of the technique, the military would announce Neal's name. However, Haley used her influence to spread the news that Neal had the ability to transform everyone in the Fortress City into paranormals. After hearing the whole story, Lena's eyes widened, and her mind could not wrap around it. Charles, why does Haley want to destroy Neal? Neal did not do anything to her. She did not have the deep understanding of human nature that the apocalypse had given Charles. Harper said, if she and her family want to quickly build a cohesive force, then it is advisable to set a concrete goal for the members of that force to focus and discipline them. Otherwise, there would be no difference between them and a small gang like the Black Eagle Squadron. She did not harbor any good feelings for Haley, so of course, she would not speak up for her. Charles added, also Neal was able to help her in the beginning. She regarded the benefits that Neal brought to her as her rightful property. When they parted ways, Haley considered it a theft of the benefit she deserved. Lena was shocked. But Neal has never done anything wrong in this matter, right? The person in the wrong is Haley. Charles said, everyone should be careful now. If Haley learns that we are here, she will definitely plot against us. Her family has produced 3 medicinal awakens already. Right now, they are winning people's hearts through her influence as a celebrity. They are very dangerous. Lena was even more puzzled. But there's no enmity between us and her, right? If we're talking about revenge, it should be Harper who is looking to even the score against them. Mr. Federer sighed. It is because we might hold a grudge against her. She believes that if we get the chance, we might take revenge. Lena was silent. She was not an idiot. She just did not like to think about these things. At this moment, she finally realized something that she had subconsciously resisted understanding. The world had fundamentally changed. Charles said, Dad, Mom, you guys stay with Lena and explain things. We'll go out. Mr. and Mrs. Federer nodded. Charles's words were too painful. This kind of thing was more suitable for them to teach their daughter. After leaving the house, Charles gathered everyone in his party to talk to them. It was only now that Charles noticed that Lena's friend Penelope Wright was absent. Where's Penelope? Did something happen to her? Harper said. After we arrived here at the Fortress City, while we were searching for Lena, a man crazily pursued Penelope. She went off with him. Charles nodded. Since it is her own choice, let her do as she pleases. All he cared about was whether Penelope had betrayed him. Since she had only changed protectors and hadn't done anything to harm the people around her, he could not be bothered to pursue the matter. Now it was time to discuss how to deal with Haley. Charles summoned the creatures from hell. He said to his followers, these monsters can be used to protect you now. Everyone's eyes lit up. With the protection of these hell beasts, their security would naturally increase greatly. Charles continued, however, you have to consider this carefully. These creatures were summoned by me. Of course, they will be monitored by me. If you are worried that I will invade your privacy, then it is best to decline. Tommy said, I think it is best to give these to the girls. Harper agreed immediately. Yes, that makes sense. She had almost been abused by Haley's bodyguards. Even after coming to this relatively safe fortress, she had almost suffered another disaster. Privacy was not more important to her than her own safety. Lena's friend Blair Clark said, I want one too. The driver, whose name was Hank Tuttle, asked meekly, Can I have one? His relationship with everyone was the most tenuous. He felt it was presumptuous to make such a request, but he still wanted to give it a try. Unexpectedly, Charles nodded. Of course. Charles assigned the Dark Mage to Harper, the Hellthorns to Blair, and the Patchwork Beast to Tuttle. Although the monster was ugly, Tuttle was not dissatisfied. Indeed, he was thrilled. His only outstanding skill was driving. This function was not irreplaceable. Others in the party might not be as skilled as he, but most of them could drive competently. Now Charles was willing to assign a bodyguard from hell to him. To Tuttle, this was the sign of official acceptance into the team. As was his wont, Charles intended to deal with Haley directly. He simply needed to kill Haley and the people behind her. He believed that, with 10 years of experience in the darkest days of the apocalypse, dealing with a few Awakens would be very simple. However, the fortress city was currently in a state of turmoil. The people there still lacked a sense of security. If Charles suddenly killed a number of influential people, it could cause an upheaval throughout the entire community. Moreover, Charles knew that it might be easy to deal with Haley, but it would be difficult to help Neil. Neil's enemy was not only Haley, but also the conservative ancient martial families, especially the Neil family in the West District. These ancient families might not have shown their power in the old era, but they had built a strong foundation in martial arts. Although Charles was not afraid of them, he could not use the simplest and most violent way to solve the problem now that his family was with him. It would be best if he could separate the two objectives so that no one would think that he was helping Neil. The sky gradually turned dark. Everyone went to rest as Charles began to refine his bone spurs. Bone spurs had an interesting growth rate. They could grow as long as they absorbed blood. Charles used them as built-in daggers. He drew runes that condensed into an essence talisman. However, just as the essence talisman was about to fully cohere, it suddenly showed signs of instability. Charles spat out a mouthful of medicinal essence blood and fused it into the medicinal essence talisman, enabling it to stabilize. Using the true fire of Sanmo, Charles refined an ice seal talisman. This was an evolved version, with an even stronger effect. Then he began to use the true fire of Sanmo to further refine his bone spurs. The contents of his ancient book were all-encompassing. There was a lot of information regarding artifact forging, but he didn't have time to learn. He could only use the simplest method: smelting, forming, and then quenching and cooling. The bone spurs gradually softened under the burning of the true fire of Sanmo. Charles took the opportunity to infuse the innate sword energy into the bone spurs, changing their shape. During the refinement process, Charles also took out some iron and fused it into the spurs. After a few seconds, the shape of a long sword formed. Charles immediately used the ice seal talisman to cool the bone spurs. "Finally done," he said. Charles wiped the sweat off his forehead. His face was pale. Although the whole process had taken less than half a minute, it had consumed a lot of his energy. It was more tiring than a multiple-hour fight. However, looking at the longsword in his hand, he could not restrain the joy in his heart. This sword was pure white. It was just over 3 feet long, with a wooden hilt. Although it looked delicate, Charles did not worry too much about it. At worst, he could just refine it further after obtaining some more precious materials. At this stage, he just needed to kill people easily. Because the sword had the ability to increase one's strength by absorbing an enemy's blood, Charles named it the Blood-Drinking Sword. The sword lacked a handguard. Moreover, the handle of the sword was completely smooth, and it was very easy to slip out of one's hand when used. According to common forging standards, this was undoubtedly an unqualified sword, but it was very compatible with Charles's fighting style. After refining the longsword, Charles drew a storage talisman on his arm as a place to hide it. This would allow him to draw the blade very quickly. In a life-and-death battle, sometimes the smallest advantage was the difference between living and dying. Perhaps he could rely on his rich combat experience, but if he was careless because of this, it was only a matter of time before he made a fatal mistake. Should I give it a try? He wondered. Looking at the sharp tip of the sword, Charles could not help but test it with his hand. The blood-drinking sword penetrated his palm without any hindrance, but he did not feel any pain. He knew that this was an extreme display of sharpness, so he hurriedly pulled it out. He did not doubt that if his hand trembled slightly, it was very likely that the sword would cleave it in two. "Rejuvenation talisman," he said. Charles used the rejuvenation talisman to recover his injuries. When he looked at the blood-drinking sword again, he was even more satisfied. On the morning of the second day, Charles received the good news that Alice had broken through to a new level of power. "Finally, I can use my power for more than just bathing," Alice cried. Alice was very excited. As Charles had become stronger and stronger, her position in the team had become more and more awkward. After all, her combat strength was not as good as Charles's, and Charles's healing ability was not as good as Sylvia's, which left Alice feeling like the weak link. However, now she could turn water into ice, and the ice blade technique was devastatingly effective. After breakfast, Lena pulled Charles to the side and said in a low voice, "Charlie, I'm sorry I misunderstood you." Hearing his sister's apology, Charles felt tremendous relief. This meant that she had acknowledged and understood him. There was nothing more exciting for him than this. However, he was still a little curious. "How did you figure it out?" Lena looked at Charles with admiration. "Mom and Dad told me that you and the military are in cahoots, so your job is to deal with dark forces in secret, like a spy. You do great things, but no one understands you." Yesterday, their parents had told her a lot of stories about the people behind the scenes. Charles felt his vision turn dark. He had thought their parents would use gentle persuasion to make Lena understand him. He did not expect them to construct such a ludicrous story. The higher he was praised, the lower he would fall. Once he had established a glorious and positive image, as soon as he did a single thing wrong, the misstep would be infinitely magnified. Thinking of this, Charles felt his scalp tingle. He knew their parents hadn't put him in this position on purpose. Of course, they didn't mean to hurt him. They just wanted him to be restrained, to consider his image in Lena's heart when he acted. This way, he would be able to maintain his moral bottom line. Charles shook his head with a bitter smile. Then he patted his sister's head. "It's good that you know, but you have to know one more thing. The people I want to deal with are very bad. When they can't beat me, they will probably come after you." Lena patted her chest. "I'm not afraid. You will protect me." Charles asked, "What if I'm not here?" Lena looked worried. "What should I do?" Charles replied, "You must learn to protect yourself. Don't trust others easily. I will teach you what you need to know." Lena nodded obediently. After what her parents had said, in her eyes, anyone who went against her brother must be a bad person. Charles called everyone together. Charles announced, "Since Haley means to use martial arts to attack Neil, we need to do the same thing. We have our own martial arts cultivation method. From now on, we will spread it everywhere in the fortress." This was Charles's strategy. Since Haley wanted to recruit people, Charles only needed to give her some competition and recruit people of his own. Haley naturally would not sit idly by and ignore him. She would take the initiative to come to him. A sensational piece of news soon spread like wildfire throughout the fortress city. Many people knew one thing, which was that paranormals could be made through training. The refugees chattered, "Have you heard? Ordinary people can also become paranormals." "Stop dreaming." "I'm not dreaming. Someone in the Eastern District told me this." "Then why don't you do it?" "Their conditions are too harsh, and it is said to be dangerous." "How about we go and take a look?" At first, many people were skeptical about the news. However, as word spread, more and more people became excited by the idea. Soon the Summers family heard about it. Haley was livid. "I didn't think that Charles would use Neil's cultivation technique to benefit himself. Isn't he afraid that Neil would take revenge on him?" Because Neil did not tell her that Charles had improved his technique, she thought that Charles had stolen the technique from Neil. Of course, that wasn't the real reason she was angry. It was because Charles had taken the cake from her hands. A middle-aged man in a white suit swirled the red wine in his glass. "Actually, this is not a bad thing for us. His actions must have gone against Neil's wishes and alienated the military. Without the support of public opinion, the higher he climbs, the farther he falls." Haley was deep in thought. "Dad, what do you think we should do? Should we push him when he is in danger or just watch him die on his own?" Haley had originally planned to find a backer for herself after coming to the fortress city. Then she learned that 3 Awakens had appeared in her family, including her father. This made her overjoyed. With 3 Awakens as their foundation, what was there to be afraid of? She could now become someone else's backer. Of course, if she had known that Charles had killed 11 Awakens in a single day, she would not feel so secure about her position. Mr. Summers' eyes narrowed slightly as he said, "No, we just need to give him a little push when he finds himself in a desperate situation." In the opinion of Haley's powerful family, the military would not allow such an uncontrollable civilian force, such as the one Charles seemed to be forming, to rise in their territory. Smaller rogue organizations were not wiped out by the military because they were too weak to justify mobilizing against. But if Charles were to expand on a large scale, he would get their attention. What if Charles doesn't fall into a desperate situation, or maybe we can't afford to wait? Haley asked. Mr. Summers' eyes were full of confidence. No matter how capable he is just a young man who is not very experienced in the world. I have plenty of ways to deal with him, even if he is really some kind of martial arts phenomenon. Haley's eyes were cold. Unless he is willing to help me deal with Neil, I will not let him off easily. She remembered every person who had ever brought her humiliation. She would go to any lengths to take revenge on anyone who dared to slight her. Meanwhile, Charles was busy with the large crowds who came to ask questions. They asked, "Is it true that you have a way to turn others into paranormals? If you have a way, tell us! Are you going to confirm it or not? If you don't want to say, then we'll leave." Charles looked at the crowd. He smiled sarcastically. "You were asking for my help, but now that there are so many of you, you immediately act entitled." When there were fewer people, they humbly asked Charles to teach them cultivation techniques. When the crowd reached critical mass, humble pleas became righteous demands. Charles reflected that reason was a very precious quality because it was so very rare. Tina frowned and said, "But are we really going to publicize our ways?" To her mind, access to the cultivation method should be very exclusive. The more it's spread, the less precious it would be. Charles said, "If I don't teach them, Neil will." The truth was, even if Neil himself did not agree, the military would eventually ignore personal wishes and forcefully promote it. Therefore, this information was only precious now. Alice curled her lips and said, "I don't need explanations. Even if you tell me all of your plans, I might not be able to understand everything. You can arrange it however you want." As the crowd outside went unanswered, people started to become anxious. Then they started to turn angry. They growled, "Are you going to tell us or not? Hurry up, our time is precious. Hurry up and announce it. This can't be a joke, right? If this is some kind of con job, we'll teach them a lesson." As everyone's emotions ignited, many clenched their fists and prepared to vent their frustration violently. Hence, many of them took on an arrogant attitude, saying, "You made us wait for so long for nothing." "That's right. Stop wasting our time. Hurry up and show us. We still have to go back to eat." Charles said loudly, "Everyone please calm down and listen to me. Please maintain order. Otherwise, how am I going to teach anyone anything?" The crowd's belligerence continued. "Then quickly say it! Hurry up!" Charles felt a little stuck. These people thought that as long as they had great numbers, their will would prevail. That was why they goaded him so outrageously. After a few tense minutes, the crowd finally managed to calm down. After all, they still wanted Charles to teach them the cultivation techniques. Charles said, "Since everyone wants to become a warrior, let's talk about the things we should take note of first for everyone's safety." The crowd remained impatient. Someone bellowed, "Cut the crap and get straight to the point!" In a flash, Charles shot an ice arrow from his hand, stabbing the heckler through the chest. The person who had been hit by the ice arrow looked down at his chest in disbelief. He had never thought that he would be killed in public, in the safety of a crowd. The rest of the crowd was stunned. Before they could react, Charles's hand suddenly ignited with red flames. Then he leaped into their midst. "Ah!" the crowd cried. The people who were not quick enough to react were ignited on the spot. They screamed miserably and rolled on the ground in a futile attempt to extinguish the flames on their bodies. The panicked crowd yelled, "What is this? He killed someone! He killed someone! What does he want to do? He wants to kill us! He's a madman! Everyone run!" No one had expected anything like this. Had Charles summoned everyone here just to kill them? "Alice, put out the fire, then treat the loudmouth," Charles commanded. Following Charles's order, Alice quickly put out the fire and treated the man who had been pierced by the ice arrow. By this time, more than half of the crowd had dispersed. Some went straight to the police, while others simply ran for their lives. They had expected a life-saving saint, not a murderous demon. It was easy to bully saints after all. The remaining people moved farther back. When they saw that Charles wasn't pursuing them, they gathered their courage and moved closer again. "Everyone don't panic. I was just clearing out some troublemakers," Charles explained. "I got the news ahead of time. Some people wanted to stop the spread of my cultivation method, so they sent people to make trouble here. They wanted to make the situation chaotic before I could say anything meaningful, and then kill me during the chaos. They are really crazy." Hearing Charles's words, some believed him and felt a burst of anger in their hearts. Still, his explanation still left a lot of people unsatisfied. It didn't really matter. These people might not believe Charles's words, but they were still hopeful about the cultivation method. Charles continued, "These saboteurs who disturbed my presentation have been dealt with. I believe the rest of you will listen to me respectfully." Looking at the burned corpses on the ground, everyone complied. Alice and the others shook their heads. These people were despicable. Charles continued to address his shell-shocked audience. "First of all, I want to tell everyone the risks of this cultivation technique. The biggest risk is the death rate, which is now about 50%. There were a total of 20 people in the first batch of cultivators, and only 4 of them are still alive. Judging from your expressions, you have some questions. We all remember school. Raise your hand first. Madam, please ask your question." The woman who was called on had a frightened look on her face. "Why is the mortality rate so high? Also, didn't you say that the mortality rate was 50%? Why did only 4 out of 20 survive?" Everyone nodded in unison. They had the same questions. Charles explained, "Because this technique is still in the experimental stage. The mortality rate at the beginning is naturally higher. But because of the first batch of volunteers as experiments, the risk of death has been reduced to 50%. The next batch might even be lower. I am here to recruit the next batch of volunteers." Some of the people in the crowd forgot themselves and blurted out complaints. "What? He thinks we're lab rats!" Then they quickly shut their mouths, afraid that Charles would burn them too. Charles said righteously, "This is a great cause dedicated to mankind. If there isn't someone willing to take the risk, how can the cultivation method be improved? How can humans improve? But please rest assured, as more and more people cultivate, I believe the death rate will become lower and lower, and that the risk will ultimately be reduced to an acceptable level. When this cultivation method truly becomes safe, grateful future generations will remember your contributions." If it wasn't for the fact that smoking corpses were still lying on the ground, the gathered people would have already started cursing. A 50% mortality rate? Who in their right mind would dare to train? Furthermore, this death rate was a guess. The death rate of those who had first cultivated the technique had reached 80%. What was even more outrageous was the promise that their deaths would pave the way for others. So what? Why should they have to sacrifice themselves to help others? "After you've thought it through, come back to me in an hour. I'll officially teach you the cultivation method then," Charles said. Charles went back into the house. Alice asked, "Are you really recruiting people?" Charles smiled. "What else?" Tina thought about it and said, "Boss, this is like a screening, right?" "You're right," Charles said. "Even with a high-risk cultivation method, there are many people who will want to practice it, especially those who have been bullied by paranormals or those who are jealous of paranormals. They are willing to take high risks for high returns." This was the mentality of a gambler. Although the death rate was very high and would scare away many people, it wouldn't scare away everyone. Harper said, "But it's only the first batch of people who face that death rate. The second batch's death rate will be greatly reduced. I believe that the majority of people will want to wait to join the second batch of people becoming paranormals." There were only a few people who had the spirit to sacrifice themselves after all. "Most of them said no," Tina said. Charles just smiled and said, "The more you give people, the less gratitude you receive. They're happy to leave most of the hard work to the army. They just want to reap the rewards without risking themselves." Since he had seen the future, he had a stronger grasp of human nature, so little surprised him. Besides, he knew exactly which people he needed and what kind of talent was worth nurturing. Few people engaged in loyalty purely for its own sake, so they needed to be given a reason. People like Sylvia were in the minority. "Those who are aware of the conditions and still dare to learn have great courage," he said. "Either they're willing to sacrifice themselves for others, or else they are wise enough to realize the importance of being a step ahead of everyone else. He sighed. Of course, there are also people who act out of hatred. He looked out the window at the people who seemed to be having an intense discussion. Spirit, courage, and intelligence, he said. As long as someone has any one of those, then they can nurture it and improve themselves. As for the others, they have given up on these things to become powerful. Do they expect me to educate and guide them one by one? He shook his head. This is how we can select the right people. If they have any of the required elements, we'll see it in their eyes. And if they don't grasp the opportunity, then that's not my fault, he thought. I only have time to train so many people, and I can't waste my time on those unwilling to learn. News of what had happened at Charles's place quickly spread throughout the entire fortress, so it soon reached Haley and her family. Max Summers slammed his glass down on the table, shattering it. He was so furious that the veins on his forehead were throbbing. How dare he do this? He demanded. How dare he? He had assumed Charles would use the cultivation methods as a foundation to develop his own power, but he had not expected him to speak about all the shortcomings of these methods. After all, Charles had obtained the same cultivation techniques they had, so if there was a problem with the ones Charles used, then it would be an issue with their methods too. Even worse, they had publicly announced their techniques, and Charles was now telling everyone that their methods carried a high risk of death. It would destroy their credibility, and Haley's influence would decline over time. What would people think of them then? Dad, don't worry, Haley said, trying to calm him down. Although Charles's actions did have a negative impact on us, the ones who were affected most were the Neal family. At that reminder, Max forced himself to take a deep breath. You're right, he said. If the Neal family has any sense at all, they'll use some low-level techniques from the outer sect as a foundation to win people over and develop their forces. That family was very powerful in the old days, Haley said. Although their status has been affected by the paranormals, they still have enough power that they shouldn't be underestimated. I'll keep an eye on the Neal family, Max assured her. Then he thought of something and said, But we cannot rely on that family's power to eliminate Charles. That doesn't help us. If the Neal family takes charge here, then how are we going to establish ourselves? Haley was stunned. Then are we going to sit by and watch Charles and Kevin while we do nothing? Max shook his head. We must watch carefully and arrange things to our own benefit, he said. This is a trivial matter, so we can't afford to overreact. Unlike his daughter, he wasn't a vengeful person. Everything he did was based on the potential advantage to him or to his family. He was willing to play nice with his enemy if it achieved the result he wanted. He was even prepared to make peace with his enemy if he saw an advantage in it. In fact, as long as the reward was big enough, he wouldn't hesitate to sacrifice his own daughter. So, although he was infuriated by Charles's actions, he decided to let it go and not seek revenge. He hadn't forgiven Charles, but acting against him wasn't in his own best interests. Then what should we do? Haley asked. A young man barged in and said, Dad, I just found out something interesting. When Charles was spreading the news about our methods, someone from the military was helping him. Is that true, Tyler? Haley asked, shocked. But it isn't in the military's interest to do this. Why are they letting him do whatever he wants? Who says it isn't in the military's interests? Max said, raising an eyebrow. When Charles made the announcement, he reminded us that the first people to practice the cultivation techniques were the least likely to survive, Tyler said. So what does it say if the military is the first to attempt it? What would everyone think of the army then? They would be heroes who are willing to sacrifice themselves for the sake of others. Haley gritted her teeth. I would never have expected the military to do such a thing for the sake of their reputation. She would have thought such tricks were beneath them, but it seemed she had been wrong. Still, they were risking their lives, even though they were doing so in full view of the public, making the most of their sacrifice. That sort of publicity was bound to be effective. Max rubbed his temples and said, Well, if that's the case, then the military will treat Charles as a sacrifice, so it's time for us to make a decision. We must forge an alliance with the military, the Neal family, or Charles. Otherwise, we'll miss out on everything. The general population were uncertain, so this was the time for the Summers family to rise up and show their strength. Although, unlike Charles, They had no knowledge of the future. Their rich life experiences allowed them to make some educated guesses about what might happen. "The military is currently too large and under too many constraints," Tyler said. "If we join them, we won't be considered important at all. The same goes for the Neal family. If we want to join them, we will be treated as inferior." "So that leaves us with Charles," Max said thoughtfully. "We'll have to work to get him on side, and then we can influence him." "Exactly," Tyler said. "Charles is extremely talented, but if he knows what's good for him, he will agree to work with us. We can always kill him and take his place if he doesn't. He's definitely the best option." "I was expecting to see the people who wish to learn the cultivation methods," Charles said, looking at the people in front of him. "I certainly didn't expect you to arrive first." He leaned back in his chair, pretending to be casual. "Did you come to advise me not to announce these cultivation techniques?" 7 people stood in front of him, but there were another 20 to 30 people outside. These 7 were merely representatives of the others, and they were all paranormals. Their purpose was clear. They wanted to stop Charles from spreading the news of his cultivation technique. All the paranormals were in influential positions, so they were not easy to ignore. Even though some of the more moral among them protected others, they were still a force to be reckoned with, and they made people uneasy. But if everyone could become a paranormal, it would put everyone on a more equal footing. The person in charge of negotiating with Charles was a beautiful woman wearing a white shirt. She sat in front of Charles, watching him carefully. Every move she made attracted the attention of all the men present, including Charles, and they found it difficult to look away. She crossed her legs and smiled at him. "You're a smart person," she said, "and you know what we are. So why don't we skip all the nonsense? Do you agree or disagree?" A paranormal standing behind her said, "Before you answer, think about the consequences of refusing us." "Do you think that by coming here you can stop the spread of the cultivation method?" Charles asked, smiling. "It's inevitable, so you cannot stop it." The paranormals had rushed in before the 1-hour deadline had passed. They had clearly been watching the crowd and had seen what was happening. Then, when they had spotted an opportunity, they had seized it. The woman's expression grew interested. "Really?" she asked. Charles didn't attempt to hide anything. "This technique has started to become popular in the military, but because it is so dangerous, it hasn't spread to the public yet. But it is only a matter of time until it does. By the time this technique is widely known, I will already be a few steps ahead and will have found people to join me." Everyone stared at him. A young paranormal asked, "Do you really believe that?" Charles shrugged. "I can try. It's easy for the army to find people. Anyone who learns a cultivation method can become a power artist, so they have already begun their experiments. And even if they fail, it's still valuable scientific research." Everyone looked thoughtful. After all, the people in the army were already widespread. So if Charles was lying, it would be easy to catch him out. The woman smiled bitterly and said, "Well, if that's the case, then there's nothing more to say." She didn't have time to play games, so when she realized she wouldn't get anywhere, she prepared to leave. The other paranormals looked at each other and frowned, unable to believe they hadn't been successful. "Wait a moment," Charles called out. "Is there anything else?" the woman asked, turning to look at him. "You don't have to worry," Charles said. "As long as we work well together, then even the most powerful people will be forced to serve us." "What do you mean?" the woman asked. The others watched Charles, waiting to hear what he would say. They had come because they had been worried Charles would threaten their positions. But if he intended to allow them to keep their status, then everything would be fine. Charles took out a crystal core and said, "This was left behind after we killed some monsters. These cores can increase the strength of our paranormals, but it's not efficient to rely only on ourselves to kill the monsters. Let more people become warriors and help us, and then we can quickly increase our strength. As long as we have enough crystal cores, our strength will forever surpass theirs," a paranormal pointed out. "So why bother?" "Because they can provide us with more of the cores," Charles pointed out. "After all, power artists cannot absorb medicinal crystal cores themselves." Everyone grew excited. If Charles was right, then it would be possible to realize his idea. Of course, doing the actual process They might encounter some difficulties, but it was generally still feasible. The woman sat down again. "So, you recruited these people to work for you?" she asked. "There must be more to it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have shared this cultivation technique for nothing, even if it would eventually be used by the military." She shook her head. "Even if these crystal cores are useless to others, why would anyone risk fighting monsters and then hand them over to you? What's in it for them?" As far as the paranormals were concerned, the greatest benefit they could provide others was their protection. But if these warriors became stronger in the future, then would they still need such protection? Wouldn't they grow jealous and seek to overthrow the paranormals? "Very smart," Charles said approvingly. "I do have something else up my sleeve, but I need more like-minded people to join me. Otherwise, without absolute power, how can I maintain my position?" Even Alice and her classmates were stunned by this, and they realized Charles had planned all this. His strategy was more complex than they had thought. "Explain," the woman said. "It's simple," Charles said. "Let's work together and build a force. It doesn't matter if we fight each other for power. If you have the ability, you can even take my place as leader. But we must have one basic rule. We must unite when facing enemies." Everyone began to mutter to each other. They may have arrived together, but that didn't mean they were on the same side. Still, if they could unite and work together, they would be extremely powerful. Moreover, their strength would keep increasing. Even if many power artists appeared in the future, it wouldn't matter, because they were already a step closer to their goal. Seeing the interest in everyone's eyes, Charles continued. "Now is a time of great uncertainty. Once the army popularized the cultivation method, then the individual will no longer have any status. But if we grab this opportunity, then we will be the ones to shape the future." Everyone gaped at Charles. His vision of the future was appealing, but it seemed very ambitious. After a few seconds, the woman said, "It's certainly an attractive idea, but how can we be certain things will work out the way you claim?" "That's right," someone exclaimed. "Why should we believe you?" "Maybe you just want to use us," another man said. Charles was good at giving speeches, but he could be lying, and they had no intention of allowing him to fool them. "I'm not asking for your trust," Charles said, looking around at them. "And if you don't want to help me, I'll simply establish a small force of my own. If you want to join, you can do so. But if you don't, I won't force you. And if you do decide to join me, then as long as you don't do anything to harm me, you can quit at any time. The choice is yours." They all realized Charles wasn't asking them for anything, and it seemed like the agreement would not be binding if they changed their minds. "My name is Olivia Ellington," the woman said, stretching out her hand, "and I think we have a deal." "My name is Charles Federer," Charles said, shaking her hand, "and I'm looking forward to working with you." When Charles held on a little too long, Olivia pulled her hand back. "Well, since we're partners," she said, "shouldn't you share some of the details of the plan now?" A long-haired young man frowned. "Olivia, how can you just believe him like that?" "Did you listen to what he said?" she asked. "It's not as though we've signed anything. If he lies to us, then we will simply dissolve the partnership." Charles pointed at the people outside the window. "Before the military popularizes the technique, you must recruit as many people as possible," he said. "Even if there are no power artists among them, many people will join, looking for protection. I want the first batch of people. 2 hours later, I will hand over the technique to you and allow you to recruit members for yourselves. From then on, we each keep whichever people we manage to recruit." Olivia narrowed her eyes. "Why do I feel like there's something else going on here?" she asked. "Aren't you afraid we'll just take the technique and leave?" Charles shrugged. "There's no long-term benefit in doing so," he said. "And if such a thing were to eventually happen, then so what? We could still be of use to each other." "How?" Olivia asked. "The military has developed a communication device," Charles explained. "It's nowhere near as convenient as a cell phone, but we can still use it to ask each other for help. Soon, the military will send some of these devices to us to keep in touch." Everyone was shocked and began to shout out questions. "You're from the military? How can they help us? Why would they help us?" The civilian forces were never comfortable with the military. They always suspected that the army might target them someday, so they preferred to keep their distance. But, although they didn't want to be tied to the military, they still hoped the army would protect them. Charles shook his head. "I'm only cooperating with them," he said. "After all, the situation is urgent. If the military cannot change the situation, then they must at least be able to monitor it. The only downside is that we must be careful not to draw their attention." "If that's the case, will we gradually be infiltrated by the military?" Olivia asked, frowning. "Will we end up under their control and lose our freedom?" Everyone began to mutter again, sharing her concern. Charles rolled his eyes. "Do you think this is like the movies?" he asked. "Why would the military wish to control us? Right now, the soldiers are all becoming power artists, and they still have many firearms. Do you think there's any benefit for them in controlling us?" Olivia was at a loss for words. She hadn't thought of it that way. But she still wasn't convinced. "I'm not sure I'm buying that," she said. "Yesterday, I wiped out a small gang called the Green Dragon Society," Charles told her. "Their leader used his own strength to imprison some women. The military is worried that paranormals like him will become more common." A murderous look appeared in Olivia's eyes. "Are these gangsters still alive?" "Don't worry," Charles assured her. "No one from the gang survived. With the help of the military, I executed them all." A young man standing behind Olivia frowned. "Does the military intend to use this as weapons to deal with such things?" he asked. "How can you guarantee the military won't exert control over us?" They knew how the world worked. If the military supported them, then they would want something in return. But they were not prepared to surrender their freedom, and they were afraid the army would take more than they were willing to give. Charles spread his hands. "I have no right to make this decision for you," he said. "It's up to you to decide. I've merely explained how things stand and offered you this opportunity. But remember, if you let it pass you by and struggle to recruit more people, then what will happen to your power then? What will you do? Find someone else to work for?" The young man glared at Charles, infuriated by his attitude. But when he went to step forward, others pulled him back. Charles's idea was tempting, and they realized it was an excellent opportunity. They had previously tried to contact some of the other paranormals, but they had realized it would be extremely difficult to persuade them to join forces. Everyone had their own thoughts and opinions, and it was difficult to achieve a consensus. Some people cared only about themselves, while others felt they had a responsibility to those who were weaker than they were. There were even those who refused to get involved due to petty vendettas between families. Under such circumstances, it was impossible to persuade many people to work with them. But several gangs had managed to join forces in the past, which made them dangerous. These gangs were a foundation that could be used to build an incredibly powerful force. The young man thought about it for a moment, and then said, "I'm still not convinced." The long-haired man smiled. "I think he's given us enough assurances. I just hope I can be involved in recruiting the first batch. After all, I'm a paranormal, so I can be useful." A middle-aged man nodded. "I agree. After all, if I join, I'll have a chance to take my share. But if I don't join, I'll get nothing." The young man frowned at them. "Are neither of you willing to continue negotiating the terms of an agreement?" he asked. Olivia sighed. "Even if he makes more promises, would you believe him?" The young man didn't know what to say. He found it difficult to commit to the agreement without any assurances. The others seemed to have no such qualms as they each voiced their agreement. "I'll also join." "As will I." "I won't lose anything by agreeing, so I'm in." By this point, 6 out of the 7 paranormals had agreed. Just as the middle-aged man had said, if they joined, they'd at least have the opportunity to share in any success. Besides, if Charles really intended to betray them, then they were more than capable of dealing with him. They were confident in their own strength, so they weren't afraid of Charles playing tricks on them. The young man looked at Charles. "Is this agreement beneficial to you?" he asked. "If we really quit, then wouldn't you spend a lot of energy searching for us? Do you expect me to believe you would do something that wasn't in your own interests?" He wouldn't trust a man who acted in a way that harmed his own interests. So if Charles had nothing to gain from this deal, the man would walk away. "I have the military backing me up," Charles said. "So even if you left, you wouldn't be able to do anything to me. On the contrary, if I needed your help with something, or if we had a common enemy, You probably wouldn't refuse to assist me, would you?" The young man thought for a moment and then said, "No, I see your point." He realized that Charles would still be the leader, no matter what happened. After all, with the military's backing, Charles was in a strong position, so he would be able to hold the alliance together. Of course, he didn't know that Charles didn't really have the backing of the military and was merely bluffing. Charles was relying purely on his own strength. And loyalty didn't matter to him. 10 loyal people were less important to him than 100 people who only pretended to be loyal. As long as such people maintained the appearance of loyalty, they would act in such ways that benefited him. After all, loyalty was only useful in desperate situations, and Charles had no intention of getting into such a position, so he didn't care if the people around him were genuinely loyal. He couldn't afford to miss this opportunity to recruit others, so he would nurture each of them, always remaining aware of the threat of the enemy and possible betrayal by his own people. "I'm willing to learn the cultivation techniques," one woman said. She stepped forward, her eyes flashing with displeasure. "You've made the right choice," Charles said. Olivia signaled everyone to pay attention, and then they watched Charles perform. Charles injected a strand of energy into the woman's body and taught her how to circulate it. "It's done," he said. "You're a warrior now, but you must remember to work on it gradually. If you overdo it, you'll only hurt yourself." The woman nodded, but Charles wasn't sure she had been listening. "I want to learn too," another woman said. "And me," called a man. Once they had seen that the first volunteer had come to no harm, others were eager to try, and one by one, they asked Charles to teach them. "But I don't have to teach you all," Charles said, raising an eyebrow. Everyone became anxious and began to shout, making many promises. "If you make me a paranormal, I'll do anything. Anything at all. Just teach me and I'll work for you. I'll be your servant and you can send me anywhere." But Charles knew what they were thinking. They would say anything right now. Once they had what they wanted, they would stop listening to him. "I think you've all forgotten about the high death rate," Charles pointed out. "Don't think that everything will be fine after the initial danger has passed. You could die at any time during the process of cultivation." The others weren't dissuaded and began to shout again. "We're not afraid of death. Yes, we'll take the risk. It's worth it to become stronger." As long as the rewards were tempting enough, there would always be people willing to risk their lives. Charles frowned. "But I'm afraid that if something were to happen to you, then your families would blame me. Then those who want to attack me will use that as an excuse." They all denied it. "We won't blame you. Yes, we'll take responsibility for everything. We'll do whatever you ask." They didn't know how to convince him. Earlier, it might have been possible, but Charles had already selected more than a dozen people. The woman who had already benefited from Charles's help spoke up. "There is a certain risk to this technique, but I'm sure you can improve it. So can I stay by your side? Then if there are any problems, you'll be able to help me." Charles smiled at her. "What's your name?" She took a step forward and said, "Elena Lopez." Charles did have the ability to repair the flaws in the cultivation technique and any injuries sustained during the process, but he hadn't publicly admitted it. Unlike Kevin, he was not a saint. Everything he did was based on his own interests, and this was one of the methods he used to control others. With Elena as an example, the others also started to show their loyalty. But after Charles had helped the 10 of them to become warriors, he said, "My ability is limited. I can only help so many people." Everyone sighed with disappointment, other than the lucky 10 who were filled with excitement. If everyone could become power artists, it wouldn't be such a big deal. But if only a few were granted the opportunity, then they could bask in the glory. People from the army dropped by while everyone was there, and they handed Charles a box of communication devices. "These are the first 12 units," the soldier said. "The batteries will last for a week. The furthest distance we can communicate over is about 10 miles, but we're working to improve that." Charles nodded. "Thank you." The onlookers were in an uproar. They hadn't believed Charles had such a close relationship with the army, but it seemed he could get the army to deliver whatever he wanted. Clearly, he was much more important than they had realized. In these dangerous times, everyone wanted someone powerful behind them, so the thought that Charles had the help of the military made him even more interesting. A middle-aged man dressed in tattered clothes rushed forward and shouted at the military, "I told you that he killed people! He's a murderer!" Charles sighed as he looked at the man. Few people could withstand the pressure of an apocalypse, and there were many who had experienced breakdowns and had been left incapable of rational thought. "Come with us," Tony said. "You can tell me all about it." As he spoke, the man next to him moved quickly, hitting a pressure point in the middle-aged man's neck and knocking him unconscious. Then he restrained the man and carried him away. Tina said, if he had heard about the matter at the city gate, then he wouldn't have said such a thing. As everyone watched the man being taken away, they grew even more certain that Charles had a military background, and they realized they needed to stay on his good side. Just as everyone was about to voice their allegiance, a blue flame ignited in Charles's hand. "Come back tomorrow," he said. When they noticed how serious he looked, they took a few steps back. They didn't dare risk angering Charles, so they obediently dispersed. Charles turned to Olivia and the others. "I will take 5 of the devices. Distribute the rest among yourselves. But remember that the batteries are limited, so be careful not to waste power." Olivia and the others each took 1, and then they left. Harper watched them go. "I'm sure they formed an alliance and are discussing how to use your influence," she said. "But in the end, they will betray you." After all, Charles was the leader of their group, and the only way to change that would be to take him out. Charles nodded. "I know." "Then why are you wasting so much effort on them?" Harper asked anxiously. No one could understand why Charles would work so hard to create such a force if they were going to turn against him. "What is the purpose of building such a force?" Charles asked. "It is so it can serve us. So its success does not depend on how many loyal people you can recruit. It's about how many people you can gather to your side when you need them." Alice thought it over. "You mean it doesn't matter if they have ulterior motives, as long as you can use them when you need to?" Charles nodded approvingly. "That's right. You all must remember one thing. In the post-apocalyptic era, strength is everything. And it's because I'm strong that I managed to gather you all around me. If you want to develop your own power, it's the same thing. You don't need to ensure everyone's loyalty. You only need a few trusted subordinates." He shrugged. "If Elena and the others want to take my power, then they will pay an enormous price to achieve it. After all, how could they guarantee the loyalty of their subordinates? Even if they can gain the loyalty of some, it won't be easy to maintain it. So it's better to just focus on improving yourself. Leave those with the thoughts of betrayal to realize the price of their actions. Until they actually betray me, then what does it matter if they aren't loyal?" Everyone was stunned by his answer. They didn't know why he was so confident, but he seemed certain he could keep the situation stable, so they chose to believe in him. Tommy recalled Charles's 3 conditions of betrayal, and he came up with an absurd idea. "Is this all about the second condition?" Alice swallowed hard and said, "People who resort to such tactics are really sneaky." She wondered what kind of experience Charles had gone through in the past. What would it take to create someone like him? She had met Charles's parents before, and she didn't know how they could have raised such a son.